Hello guys. Now we are going to read about Western political thought from PSIR paper 1A, and the first thinker is Plato. So, here are the PYQs for Plato. So, we are quickly going to read them, and from them, we will read what the topics we have to read. Okay. So, reality is a shadow of ideas, which is Plato's theory of ideas or forms. Then, no law or ordinance is mightier than knowledge, or the rule of philosopher king. All this is in his theory of philosopher king or rule of law. Okay. Then, about his theory of communism. Okay. About his communism and his comparison with modern communism. Okay. Then, we can also see. Uh, Yeah. His theory of justice, his theory of education, okay, which is also being asked. Then, um, then few questions are asked on criticism or who criticize Plato for his philosophy or his political standards. Okay. So first, we are going to map out what we have to study. Okay. So first is Plato's metaphysics or his theory of forms or his theory of ideas. Okay. Then second we are going to study about philosopher king and rule of law. Then we are going to study about his theory of justice. Then we are going to study about his theory of education. Then his theory of communism and criticism of Plato. And most probably we will be studying this in an answer writing format. Okay. So first we will discuss about the intro. Okay. So you can write basically two types of intros here. So first one is Plato is regarded as the father of political philosophy. Okay, because Plato sought to diagnose the systemic corruption of Athenian society, or okay, for which he constructed an architectonic ideal state governed by his theory of justice. So this kind of intro you will write when core political topics like ideal state, justice, philosopher king, education, communism, etc. is asked. Okay, and with this you can also write a quote of other thinkers which have said something on Plato. Then the second one, first one will be political. The second one is a metaphysical or philosophical intro. Okay, that means when something on his theory of forms is asked, or his theory of knowledge, or Popper's critique is asked, you can write this introduction. Okay, Plato as founder of philosophical idealism. Okay, then Plato's thoughts represent a departure from sensory empiricism. Okay, then you can also write a quote here by A.N. Whitehead, who said that the entire European philosophical tradition is nothing but the footnotes of footnotes to Plato. Okay, so you can quote him also in the introduction, which highlights that Plato's role in foundation Plato's foundational role in establishing Western political discourse. Okay, so after we are done with the intro, after this we are going to write about his methodology. Okay, so what was Plato's methodology? So basically, you know that Plato did not use a single method, rather, he used a composite multi-layered methodology. Okay, so when we say multi-layered methodology, so there are around five methodologies which he used. So first is dialectical, similar to Socrates. Then teleological, which means purpose or goal, which you can later see in Aristotle. Okay. Then deductive approach, then analogical approach or analogical method, which basically means that like drawing parallels between known concept and a complex political idea to make it intelligible. Okay, intelligible. So basically, you can say state is individual writ large. Okay, so this is basically individual state analogy. Okay, or else you can also see later when we study that he compares the philosopher king, okay, to a expert doctor. Okay, then after analogical we have prescript sorry prescriptive method, prescriptive methods, which means that a radical or normative approach aimed at political engineering. Okay, for example, building a perfect society. Okay, for it, Plato would require political engineering through the means of, for example, you can say his theory of forms. For example, he would divide human beings or people in the state based on gold, silver, and copper, and all other things. Okay, so which we will learn after this. So after we have read about Plato's methodology, now we are going to read about his first theory, that is the theory of ideas. Okay. Before that, we will quickly write the influences on Plato and his work. Okay. So first is the Spartan model of state. Okay. So as you know, Athens lost to Sparta, and that is the reason why Plato favors Spartan model over Athenian democracy model, because he thinks that democracy is basically a lottery. Okay, then we can also mention Socrates, who had a huge influence on Plato due to his theory of virtue, his knowledge, and Socrates also gave a teleological explanation of the world rather than a mechanical one. Okay, and Socrates also perceived political phenomena in an ethical framework similar to Mahatma Gandhi. Then he was also influenced by Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus for no permanence in this sensory world, whereas Parmenides gave the concept of permanence, saying that there is something permanent in if, like for example, the like the river flowing. Okay, no, no, wait. Yeah. So, here, the concept of permanence means that there is something permanent in this non permanent world. Okay. So, that is what the concept of permanence means, which led to the concept of idea. Then, so after this, we are going to read about his theory of idea. So, now we are going to read about Plato's theory of idea. So, this concept or this theory of idea made Plato the father of political science. Okay, sorry, political philosophy. Sorry. So, most important contribution of Plato, due to which he is called as the father of political philosophy. Okay, so where in this theory of idea he establishes that philosophy is the ultimate knowledge. Wait. So, so he sees philosophy as the ultimate knowledge. Okay. So this theory of idea is basically based on Socrates' theory of knowledge. Socrates' theory of knowledge, you can write know thyself. Okay. Then virtue is knowledge. Then unexamined life. Okay. And here Socrates gave the concept of true knowledge. So true knowledge, where he categorized knowledge into two types. So basically, they were ultimate knowledge, then, and the second type was opinions. Okay. So, according to Socrates, ultimate knowledge cannot be gained through sensory organs. Okay. And opinions, the second type, that is the knowledge of matter and material. Okay. And with this, we can also categorize the concept of idea into two parts, which means that reality is divided into two parts. One is metaphysical, okay, or ideas, and the other is matter. Okay. So matter basically is world of change, and metaphysics or ideas are basically the world of permanence. Above, we had written about influences on Plato. Okay. So now here you can mention Heraclitus and Parmenides. Okay. So matter. Okay. Then here in his concept of idea, Plato combines various metaphysical dimensions. Okay. Like his ontology, which means the study of reality. Then his epistemology, that is the theory of knowledge. Then is metaphysics, which is the theory of soul. Okay, and his ethics. And his ethics. So he combines all this and he gives the concept of allegory of caves. Okay, in which he quoted that reality is the shadow of idea. Okay, and this same quote was asked as it is as a PYQ. Okay, so in his book Republic, he gave the concept of allegory of caves. Okay, so basically he explained that, or he quoted that, reality is the shadow of idea, which means that the material world is an illusion. Okay, material world is illusion. Okay, and ideas or forms are the truly true ideas or forms are true reality. For example, you take the analogy here. The For example, let's take the example of a chair. Okay, so a physical chair can burn or can break. Okay, or it can also rot because it is if it is made of wood. But the idea of chair is permanent and no physical harm can happen to it irrespective of whatever it is. Okay, so which shows that the idea of chair is the true reality. Okay, here that's what Plato is trying to explain. And here in his concept of allegory of caves, basically is the dialectics. You can call this concept of allegory caves as the dialectics to freedom of soul. Okay, so here in this concept, he gave that the basically, so in short I will tell you, so there is a cave and a man is shackled there with chains, that the chains which are used to confine him inside the cave is basically his own ignorance, and there is a fire lit in the cave, and which shows the moving shadows whichever move from the cave outside the cave, and the prisoner thinks that these shadows are the reality. But once he breaks the chains and looks or goes outside the cave, he realizes what true freedom is, and all whatever the material world was showing, is not the reality, rather, ideas are the true reality. Okay, so here the sun is regarded as true enlightenment. Okay, then we can also see here, or we can also quote here Shankaracharya, who Adi Shankaracharya, sorry, who also believed that the world, sorry, this world is a world of illusion or mithya. Okay, so now, so basically, this concept or theory of idea is over. Now we'll write criticisms in short, one or two, one or two criticisms. Okay. So first is Aristotle, who believed that coexistence, who believed in coexistence of ideas as well as matter. Okay. Then we can also write here Nietzsche, who criticizes Plato, who accuses Plato of philosophical nihilism. So, according to him, Plato claims that, so according to Nietzsche, Plato claims that the physical world which we touch, feel, and live in is mere shadows or illusion, which basically means that Plato devalues human life and material world, and construction of an imaginary true world, or his imaginary ideas, stems from a fear of change. You can use this same as a criticism in the philosopher king as well. Okay, when the theory of philosopher king will be taught. Okay, so I think with this the theory of idea is done, and after this we are going to read quickly about theory of soul. Okay, so in this theory of soul, basically Plato classifies spiritual soul into three types. Okay, which is also called as the myth of metals, because Plato believed that humans are born from earth and the bodies were mixed with different metals. So he classified based on three, okay, three categories. One. So first is gold, then silver, and then copper. So gold are the people who have reason. Okay, so the people who have a gold like soul of gold. Okay, so only they can become the philosopher king. Okay, then the courageous, or who have courage, are classified in silver, and a man of appetite is classified in copper. Okay, and he believes that gold and silver are virtues, whereas copper is a vice. Okay, so basically his objective here was to stratify the society. Okay, so it was a functionalist view of the society. Okay, and the main purpose was social mobility, and these classes were not based on hereditary, they are non-hereditary. Okay, and all these can also be used for statecraft. The main purpose of this stratification was for statecraft. Okay, so the theory of soul is also over. Okay, nothing much here. Then after this we are going to read about his theory of justice. So now we are going to read about Plato's theory of justice. Okay, so first we will see where justice is mentioned in Plato. Okay, so in his book Republic, he gave the theory of justice concerning justice. So according to him, justice is architectonic value or virtue which means it is the foundational virtue. Okay, and his concept of justice is closer to the Indian idea of dharma. Okay, here here republic means justice. Okay, and it should not be understood in Latin sense, which means state or polity, which was highlighted by Barker. Okay, then so Plato's idea, or sorry, theory of justice is not merely legal or contractual. It is a moral and internal quality. Okay, so it talks about harmony. Okay, the main aim of his theory of justice was harmony. Okay, then uh, during his time, there are other views of justice or contemporary views on justice, which he had to refute in order to make his theory solid. Okay, so first, Nate views of justice. So here, Cephas, sorry, Cephalus, who states that justice is traditional moralism, which means justice is paying debt and staying true. Okay, then we have Polymarchus, whose idea is that doing good to friends and harm to enemy, but Plato criticizes it that harm is not an idea of justice. Okay, then we have Thrasymachus, who is a radical sophist who believes in the interest of the strong, and it is a realist view to political philosophy. Okay, You can also mention Glaucon, who is a pragmatist or social contract thinker. He believes that state justice is the interest of weak. Okay, and state is formed in order to protect the weak. Then, so so with this we understand that Plato's idea of justice is to be taken in broad sense, denoting right conduct. Okay. Hmm. Then after this, sorry, first we will read about Plato's idea. Now, after we have seen that he refuted everyone, so what is his main idea of justice? So basically, Plato's Republic is based on ideal state. So here, ideal state means that ideal here refers to concrete law, sorry, ideal here refers to just, which is a virtue or idea, and state here refers to, of course, laws or politics. And his view of ideal state was where justice prevailed, and what kind of justice? Distributive justice. Then we can also see that his republic, we can also see that his republic was based on three principles of justice, which were functional specialization, then that means here you can mention thinker Barker, who says that Plato's architectonic justice is basically one man, one work. Okay, fine. So, as you can see, that his first principle of justice was functional specialization. So, functional specialization, here you can quote Barker, who says that one man, Plato's justice is one man, one work, one duty, one class. Okay, so you can see here a kind of separation of power. Okay, or separation of work or duty. Then his second principle was proper stationing. Proper stationing. Okay, which means that every individual occupies their appropriate class based on their dominant mental capacity rather than lineage. So it was non hereditary and based on aptitude or reason. Then the third principle was non interference, which means that no class or individual meddles in the functioning of another. Okay, so now as you can see, these functions or these principles of justice of Plato are similar to the Indian Varna system. Okay, why? Why I will tell you, because see, the Indian Varna system had functional specialization, and they were divided into four classes. There was proper stationing, like can no kshatriya can involve himself, or like meddle in the functioning of other classes. Okay, and there was non-interference also. And basically the Indian Varna system at first was based on aptitude, and later it rigidified into the caste system. Okay, so then we can also see one of his main topics or subtopics under it, that state is individual writ large. So here basically Plato argues that state reflects human soul on a on a macro scale. Okay, so First, you can use a quote here by Plato himself. State does not come out of oak or rock. It inheres in the mind of the people living in the state. Plato. So basically, here you can use or you can see that he already classified the human personality into three elements above, uh, as rulers, soldiers, and producers. That means gold class of like class of gold, silver, and copper. Okay, so this is basically the functional specialization at an individual level or at a state level. Okay, then we can see that the principles of justice are same at both the levels, which means that at individual level and at state level. So at individual level, it is the ethical conception of justice, which says about just man. And at state level, it is the political conception of justice, which means the ideal state. Okay. And for Plato, these both are linked. Okay. So, and you can here also see similarity to Mahatma Gandhi, who also said that ethics and politics cannot be separated, but it is not similar to the views of Machiavelli, who gives the concept of dual morality and he separates ethics from politics. So, in his state, basically, according to Plato, an ideal state possessed four cardinal virtues, which were wisdom, that is reason, which was the gold class, then courage, which was the silver class, then temperance or self control, which today we call as Swaraj, which is the Indian concept of Swaraj, then justice. And in this, there were three functions, broad functions, which were ruling, defense, and production. Okay, which you can also see in the theory of soul and production. Then his criticism. Okay, so now we are going to move towards criticism, but first you can also classify this as, or you can also call this as organic view of the state. Why? Because it is not like modern social contract theorists who view state as a mechanistic or artificial creation. Okay, Plato views state through an intrinsically linked state that grows naturally out of human nature. Okay, then later you can also mention here in his three classes the Triguna theory, similar to of the Indian tradition. Okay, so now we are going to move towards criticism. So the most common criticism here is that Plato's ideal state is too much control and monitoring. Okay, here you can also quote Nietzsche, who says that, or who criticized Plato for founding a just and rightly ordered society with the help of a necessary lie. Okay, to criticize Plato for founding a just society based on lies and for giving philosophy a political influence. Then you can uh, also quote Popper, Karl Popper, who says that Plato is against equalitarianism and is anti-individual. Then you can also quote Sabine, who criticizes it as not only is it bad politics, but also bad psychology. Then you can also quote here Aristotle, that he noted that extreme unification turns a political community into a single entity, destroying diversity. Which is required in political life. Then we will also see here how Plato, psychologically determined political regimes. Okay, so here he uses this logic to explain how states decay if individuals lose rationality and control, okay, and get driven by appetite. So if individuals lose rationality or reason, state degrades from aristocracy to democracy, democracy to oligarchy to democracy, which ultimately leads to tyranny. And with this, the theory of justice of Plato is completed. Now, after this, we will read about his theory of communism. So now let's start with Plato's theory of communism. So basically, Plato wanted communism, but not for the whole state, but only for the guardian class. Okay, communism only for guardian class, as he believed that the producer class was neither possible to apply communism nor required for the producer class. Then, basically, according to him, education was the primary machinery as primary machinery to create an ideal state, and communism as a supplementary machinery. Okay, so basically, he did communism of what? Okay, so Plato wanted communism of three things, that is, property, then family, and marriage. Okay, and he wanted communism as a supplementary machinery, as communism invoked or created the spirit of sacrifice. Okay, then according to him also, marriage was for eugenic purposes only. And then, due to all this, Plato was heavily criticized. Okay, so a critical evaluation of Plato's theory of communism. So first, you can see that there was excessive regimentation, and also there was no privacy or individuality. Aristotle also criticized Plato's view of communism. So here we can mention Aristotle. So according to Aristotle, private property was a very important source of happiness for the individual, and the welfare of state. Okay, sorry. So private property was very important for individual and state as well. Then, according to him, Plato's idea of communism for family was very barbaric and regressive. You can write other points as well here. Remedies were worse than the diseases itself. This is the analogical method. Okay. Then we will conclude here that Plato's diagnosis of ideal state were correct, but the remedies were wrong. Also, after this, we are going to compare Plato's communism with Marxist or modern communism. Okay, so Plato's communism and modern communism. So, so first point, we will see from the point of view of ideology. Okay, so Plato's communism was idealist in nature. Okay, whereas Marxist or modern communism is materialist in nature. Okay, because they focus on economic determinism. Okay, then their views on state. So, according to Plato, state is a source of virtue, whereas Marxist view is that state as an instrument of exploitation, and they want to end state. Okay, then one more point here on state. Plato here, Plato here expects citizen to sacrifice their interests for the sake of the state. Okay, which means that whole over part. Okay, so Plato believed this, that individuals should sacrifice themselves or their interests for the interest of the state. Okay, but Marx calls for revolution against the state. Then on class, so Plato classifies classes in a spiritual category. Okay, that means in an uh, idealistic way or in the form of ideas. Okay, that in a spiritualistic category based on the aptitude. Okay, so here is soul theory, that gold, silver, and all. Okay, then for Marx, so basically Marx wants to abolish class and create a classless society. Society. Okay, then wait. Hmm. Then the way in which or means, okay, the means to create an ideal state according or the means of communism for Plato was non-violent, but according to Marx or supporter of violence, as he believed that there is no birth without blood. Then also the application, like to whom the communism applied. So according to Plato, only to guardian class, but according to Marx, communism for all. Okay, and there was one similarity that both Plato and Marx considered private property as evil. Okay, so with this, we are completed with Plato's theory of communism. Okay, then after this, we'll read about Plato's theory of philosopher king. Okay, so now let's talk about the philosopher king or the theory of philosopher king. Okay, so the question arises is why Plato wanted a philosopher king. Okay, so basically, what happened was Plato was deeply disturbed by the political corruption, ignorance, and especially after the loss of Athens to Sparta. Okay, so he said that until philosophers are rulers or rulers learn philosophy, there is no end to the predicament of human life. Okay, so this is what he believed. Okay, and he believed that democracy is basically a popularity contest, and that is why he opted for philosopher king. Okay, then who is a philosopher king? So basically, wait. So who is philosopher king? Okay. So basically, the a person who is governed by reason. Okay. So basically, he is from the gold class. Okay, and he is reluctant to govern. Okay. So basically, Plato states that those states are best governed where rulers are reluctant to govern rather than states where rulers are eager to govern. So basically, here Plato wants to say that where there is reluctancy to govern, okay, so basically there is no appetite or passion, okay, which will not corrupt the ruler, and that is why Plato believes that a philosopher king should be someone who is reluctant to govern. Okay, then basically how are they created? So we read above what all he did. First is the education system or his theory of education, which we'll learn after this. Then communism, which he introduced of family, property, and marriage. Okay, so these two basically are the points for the creation of a philosopher king. Then the question basically arises that what are the powers and limitations? Okay, so first, the code or a PYQ also you can call it, no law or ordinance is mightier than knowledge. So basically, if you have to write on this, okay. So I think this was a PYQ. Yeah, second one. Hmm. So basically, if you have to write on this, I will tell you what points, or in short, I will tell you. So this justifies Plato's philosophic absolutism. Okay, what does this mean? That it means that supremacy of reason untrampled by any law. Okay, so basically reason over laws. So what Plato believes that laws are rigid Okay, then they are imperfect or general, okay, and static. And he believes that like a uniform return rule cannot account for every unique circumstance or changing scenario in a state. Okay, then he believes that true knowledge is superior. Why? Because true knowledge is flexible, okay, dynamic, and what true knowledge does is grasps the ultimate form of good. Okay, because a ruler uh, who is guided by absolute reason or true knowledge can make the most just decisions in any specific context. Okay, so here you can also take his analogical methodology which Plato used to explain the role of philosopher king. Okay, so here he said it is not wise to replace an expert practitioner of medicine by or with a book of medicine. Okay, you can quote this as expert doctor analogy. Okay, then here you can also write the basic Socratic tradition or Socratic principle, that is virtue is knowledge. Okay, so basically it means that if a ruler possesses true knowledge, they act virtuously and justly. Okay, so just act, okay, or virtuous acts come naturally to the philosopher king. Okay, and so there are limits also. Wait, so there are limits as well. So limitation to philosopher kings, that is maintain the size of the state. Okay, then no excess of anything, poverty and wealth, then the prescribed education system of Plato of 50 years, then he or she cannot change the republic. Okay, cannot change the constitution of republic. Okay, and basically he is criticized, or his criticism. So criticism of his concept of philosopher king. So first we will mention Aristotle, who believes that law is reason without passion. Basically, law is impersonal. Okay, so here it means that law is basically collective reason, and there is no scope for passion. That means there will be no corruption or greed. Okay, so that is why law is reason without passion, because many people come together to form the law. Okay, and that is the collective reason. Then, sorry, then another criticism is by Volin, who says that Plato denied the participation of the average person in politics. So basically, this is the elitist view criticism. Okay, then Strauss, you can mention Strauss as well, who considered republic as greatest critique of idealism, a satire written to demonstrate the limits of politics. Then Popper criticized that Plato himself wanted to be the philosopher king. Okay, then you can also mention in Popper that Plato's philosopher king is a blueprint of totalitarianism and rejection of democratic freedom. Okay, then later Plato in laws made a theoretical shift. Okay, so Plato said that rule of law is the best. Okay, so first he criticized it, and later he made a shift that it is the best law, like rule of law is best for governance. Okay, so with this we have completed the theory of philosopher king. Then after this we will read about fascism or Plato as a fascist. Okay, so now we are going to learn about Plato as a fascist. Plato as fascist. Okay, fascism is basically totalitarianism. So why was Plato considered as a fascist first? Okay, so he was against democracy as he supported Sparta, which was a military rule. Okay, and he wanted absolute dictatorship, which is his philosopher king. Okay, then why you can see that he wanted absolute dictatorship was so basically he wanted absolute dictatorship, that means duty and discipline, which means that there is no liberty. And in his theory of class, So basically, according to him, a man of appetite can never be a man of courage or a man of reason. Okay. Then extreme regimentation of state. So in order to create an ideal state, he gave the theory of communism, where he uh, restricted or restricted or gave no liberty within the fields of family, private property, marriage, etc. Okay. Then now we will read about his criticism by Karl Popper. So why he believes that Plato is an enemy of open society. Okay, in his book Open Society and Its Enemies. So here Karl Popper tells that he calls Plato, Hegel, and Marx as enemies of open society. Okay, and he gave three arguments for this, which were basically: first, essentialism. The first is essentialism, which means that he divorced us from reality. Okay, which means his focus, Plato's focus was more on idea, okay, over matter. So that means that his focus was very shaky, okay, according to the theory of knowledge. Okay, so essentialism was basically uh, belief, not belief or opinions. Okay, then second, holism or methodological holism, which means that he sacrifices individual for whole. Okay, here basically means sacrificing individual for whole, which means whole over part. Okay, greater good. Okay, the concept of greater good. Then historicism, ideological use of history. So his version of life cycles of state. Okay, so basically every totalitarian state uses history or laws of history to justify their legitimacy. Okay, then Karl Popper believed that Plato was the forerunner of modern day totalitarianism, because Plato was hostile towards progress and humanitarian ideals like democracy. Okay. Then Popper also believed that Plato's thinking was not open for falsification. Okay. And some value addition you can do here, or you can write them as separate points as well. So basically, what Plato did was wholesale social engineering. Wholesale social engineering, that is total change. For example, you can see his theory of class, in which, using this theory, he did the wholesale social engineering by dividing people or citizens of Athens into different classes. Okay, and one more point: absence of utilitarianism. So Plato basically believed that an individual should sacrifice his interests for the sake of the state. Okay, then, in order to write a balanced view for this answer, other thinkers such as Levinson said that all these are superficial comparison and uncomparing uncomparables. You can also quote Rajiv Bhargav, who said that Popper's analysis of Plato is misleading, and Popper is ideologically biased. Okay, so Yes, and also Isaiah Berlin in criticism. Sorry, you can mention Isaiah Berlin, who attacked historicism of Plato in historical inevitability, along with Marx and Hegel. Okay, then you can also mention Winspear, who said that philosopher king is a blueprint by an authoritarian reactionary. Okay, and if you want to write a balancing view, you can also mention CEM Jode, who said that there are many similarities between fascism and Plato's tyrant state, but there are fundamental differences too. Okay, and with this, Plato as fascism is over. Now, we'll quickly, in short, write about why Plato was anti-democratic. Okay, so Plato as anti-democratic, and the reasons are basically he preferred military discipline over democracy after the defeat of Athens to Sparta. Okay, then Plato was of the Socratic tradition of rule of knowledge. Okay, also Plato was aristocratic, conservative, who was keen on reviving it. Okay, he was keen on reviving aristocracy. Okay, then he also believed that democracy is against nature, which means political equality. Then, now after this, we'll read about Plato's theory of education. Okay, so now we are going to read about Plato's theory of education. Okay, in this theory also. Okay, so in this theory, you will see as one more small part, that is Plato as first feminist. Okay, so first Plato's theory of education. So according to Plato, what was the state's role is that state is a pedagogic institution. Hmm. The state is a pedagogic institution, and its role is to impart education. Okay, it is one of the most important function, and this pedagogic institution, uh, one more another process is that the process of filtration, which means that candidates are filtered out. Okay, based on the syllabus or whatever their main agenda is. Okay, so first, that is state's role is a pedagogic institution whose process or whose objective is to filter out. Okay, and all this is given in his book Republic. Okay, then this theory of education is the result of Plato's theory of justice. Okay, so Plato basically justice, sorry, regards education as a mean to justice. Okay. Then he also wanted a rigorous scheme of education. Rigorous scheme of education in order to select the philosopher king. Okay. And basically his theory of communism also, so basically his theory of communism is also a part of his theory of education. Okay. Then few criticisms, or you can say few notes given by other scholars on his theory of education. So Rousseau, so according to Rousseau, Republic is the finest treatise on education to be ever written. Okay. Education to be ever written. Okay. Then you can also quote Nettleship, who said that his theory of education offered, basically Plato's theory of education offered a formula for dividing work and achieving harmonious cooperation. Okay. And basically, so basically what his theory of education was, that education should be a lifelong process. Okay. Which adheres to the Pythagorean idea, okay, of immortality. Okay. Education as lifelong process. Okay. So basically, knowledge was to be acquired for the sake of perfection and excellence. Okay. And basically, his theory of education was molding of souls. Okay. And you can write one more criticism here. that Plato wanted to create obedient minds or obedient systems rather than critical mind. Okay. And now we are going to write in short about Plato as Plato as first feminist. Okay. Then so basically what Plato did was that there was no distinction in the quality of souls. So basically there was no distinction in the quality of souls, okay, irrespective of their sex or their gender, okay. Then he also gave equal opportunity to women if they wanted to become the philosopher queen, okay. So this is basically a radical view in a very highly patriarchal society, okay. And the debate is that whether he really wanted liberation of women or he only viewed women from the point of view of utilization of utilization in wait, so basically utilization in service of the state, okay. So this is what basically the feminist concern was, okay. And I think with this we complete our topic of Plato. If anything is missing, please let me know, okay. Thank you.